Thank you, John, and thank you all for being here. This is a rare treat for me these days, and I'm delighted to be here and to have this opportunity to speak to you about some of my work in ecological economics, some of my scholarly work, because, you know, as an administrator, Dean Watson will confirm that they usually give us 15 minutes, right, to say welcome about something or so. So this is a real treat. And if you're wondering about my Vermont connections, it's a real delight. Hi, Bob. It's a real delight to be here. I lived here actually in the state of Vermont, both in Enosburg Falls, way up at the Canadian border, and then in Poultney. So let me start with the following premise, namely that the field of economics is in serious need for changing the debate about its objectives and resulting policies. And the reason for this need for a radical change in debate is that despite the recent economic crisis and the so-called Great Recession, and despite persistent unemployment, the key message of US economic policy remains the same as it has been largely for the past 5 decades or so, namely that economic growth driven by consumption and measured in increase in GDP or GDP per capita is a good thing and must therefore be the primary focus of economic policy. Conversely, a decline or a stagnant GDP implies failure of economic policy. With the exception of a brief period in the 1970s and the oil crisis, the question is rarely asked what kind of economic growth and what qualitative measures of economic progress might be consulted either instead of or in addition to GDP. The limited role that ecological economics has played in this policy debate is regrettable. Given the strong policy focus of the field, it could play a major role in redefining the policy agenda and the sustainability debate. Ecological economics has a lot of contributions to make, not just to the environmental, but also to the social dimension of the economic growth debate. Namely, what do we have to say as a field about the jobless recovery or the growing discrepancy between haves and have-nots and the declining quality of life that is perceived by many and the risks associated with both local, regional, national, global scale environmental destruction. The German philosopher and economist Malte Faber stated as follows: ecological economics has norms that go further than those of mainstream economics, so that ecological economists are confronted with a much more complex world of ecological economics, namely a world that deals explicitly with the constraints of nature, for it acknowledges that in reality there are limits to growth in real income, and hence the question of just income distribution can neither be dispensed with by attaining boundless affluence, nor can it be diffused by unlimited economic growth, as mainstream economics proposes. So one of the most important tasks that ecological economics is bringing to this complexity then is its normative as well as its environmental focus. So why do I propose that it's particularly important to apply this normative and environmental context focus to the project of production? Well, 2 reasons. Production is defined in mainstream economic theory by consumption. Namely, it is the pursuits of consumers who seek to maximize their own individual utility that drives the generation of output. So there really is quite a lack of production theory in the economic literature. But it is, in fact, that measure of aggregate output, namely GDP, that defines economic policy, which is an interesting conundrum. The economist Nikolai Georgescu-Roegen pointed out in various of his papers, and I quote from one here that was published in 1984, in contrast to the immense literature dealing with the utility function, the production function formed the object of no critical analysis ever since the time of Philip Wickstead, which was, by the way, in 1894, if you're wondering. And Wickstead, over 100 years ago, introduced a slick tautology, namely the product being a function of the factors of production summarized in large categories of labor, land, and capital. Attention to production is therefore sorely needed, and a new conceptual model for production must accomplish at least the following. It must define production in a way that recognizes the material and social embeddedness of production and not simply its dependence on consumer demand. And secondly, it must recognize the need to sustain production and the factors that undergird the production process in the long run. So this may seem pretty self-evident, yet it has not received much consideration in standard economic production theory. And there are numerous examples, in fact, of where economic development advice and policy advice, especially in the developing world, has focused on extraction in the interest of boosting GDP in the short term without any consideration for the long-term sustainability of the productive enterprise. The question thus needs to be raised: what does a concept of production look like that can be sustained in the long run and that sustains and supports those material and non-material social, cultural, ecological contexts that first make production possible? After all, no productive workforce, no output. No natural resources, no output. No sustained creativity and innovation, no output. So how do we propose to sustain these in the long run? So those are the concepts I want to explore with you in 40 minutes, hopefully. And I want to structure it around three questions. Namely, what could a concept of sustaining production look like? What do we want to know, explore, investigate, learn as ecological economists to carry on that enterprise? And third, what are the barriers and opportunities for adopting a concept of sustaining production? So let me start with the first point, namely reframing production as sustaining production. First of all, historically, production was, in fact, a key focus of economics, namely classical economists like Smith, Ricardo, Mills, all viewed production as central to the economic enterprise. And it was not until the 19th century that the focus shifted to consumer utility and demand. A significant part of the conceptual and analytical framework of production that the classical economists had related to the economic output and its rootedness in human resources and natural resources. And they described the social and natural environmental context as constraints and capacities that entered the production process. In contrast, new welfare economics views production as chiefly driven by consumer utility. And to just quote one economist, this is a fairly recent quote from Robert Frank from Cornell, who writes that production is any activity that creates present and future utility. And utility, of course, is the thumbprint, if you will, of individual interest maximizing consumers, because there is no supposed external influence on utility. Now, this view has profound consequences. Since marketable output that satisfies consumer demand is what gives output first its value, while non-market activity that does not create marketable output has no value in this model. Likewise, inputs that aren't used in the production process and therefore aren't utilized to create marketable output has no value either. So you might say all context systems feed the economic enterprise of utility generation at the center of the model, but there is no consideration of any kind of feedback back into these context systems, and all value is assigned by the market in the center and the marketable exchange of goods and services to create utility. And utility generating output is completely mediated by the market, and activity outside of market exchange has no value. Well, that has pretty predictable results because it leads to the overuse of so-called free inputs that are not mediated in the market, and it leads to the underutilization of output that is not mediated in the market. Optimal input allocation starts from the assumption of a given stock of natural resources, and the depletion of those stocks remains invisible because there is no market exchange that reflects the declining value of depleting stocks. The context within which production takes place thus remains a source of input streams, and recipients of output, waste streams, emissions remain invisible. The distortion associated with this kind of notion of production are well known, and they have commonly been summarized under this rubric of negative externalities. Numerous examples illustrate that allocation and production decisions pay little attention to these negative externalities unless there is a deliberate process of attempting to internalize them back into the value system of the market. A good bit of work in environmental economics and ecological economics has focused on accounting for and internalizing these neglected environmental costs and valuation biases that are introduced by this standard framework. Examples include the productive value of nature, and Bob Costanza and some of his colleagues have made contributions to that field. Full cost accounting, industrial ecology, and loop closing endeavors have all been examples. Bob's work on energy have all been examples of attempting to get a handle on the neglected implications of output generation and natural resource use. Yet to lower unintended negative externalities may start with an assessment of the staggering costs that are created outside of the system. But it must then also take a closer look at the production process itself. And this runs counter to the aggregation of inputs in these broad categories of labor, land, and capital, which doesn't leave for much detail about the production process itself. As Jeddah Saudi and others have argued, what is needed is attention to the flows of input rather than simply the stocks of usable inputs, and to the transformation capacity of these inputs in the production system itself. The Italian post-Keynesian economist Pancietti describes the limitation of the current concept as follows. He writes, The model clearly has nothing to do with the phenomenon of production. The problem it deals with is optimal allocation through exchange of a certain initial endowment and distribution of resources. It became necessary to shape the theory of production in such a way as to meet the requirements of a pre-existing theory concerning the optimal allocation of stocks of resources. Now, feminist economists have focused on the social implications of these limitations of the production model. They argue that production draws upon a web of services provided in households and communities, and they raise a different set of questions about the negative externalities of production. Namely, both flows of resources, and especially labor, but also the creativity of inputs into the production process, innovation, the ability to offer and repair, maintenance, all of that depends on rest, care, restoration, regeneration of productive capacity, much of which is offered in households, communities, volunteer organizations, social networks, and such. Sadly, the burden of these sustaining, restorative care activities and so forth that first make production possible, that burden is distributed very unevenly. And it's chiefly carried by those who receive little or no remuneration for their services. It's a well-known fact that care functions tend to be at the bottom of the pay scale. So the loss of sustaining services then may well translate into less time to socialize, more stress, overburdened household community systems, less engagement in democratic institutions, and increased pressure on social support services that provide care and group recuperation. So the question feminist economists have asked is, why would one even want to evaluate negative externalities by re-internalizing them into the very system that caused all these distortions in the first place? Isn't there a better way of assigning value? These same valuation biases have also contributed to increasing pressure to move functions out of volunteer community household sectors into the marketplace, so they are first assigned value in the first place. And of course, that has a whole lot of other ramifications. The feminist economist Mary Mello writes, "If payment is not made in economic terms, someone will pay in other ways. They will die before their time, sleep on the street, be nursed by a relative, go without shoes, and walk miles to the well." The discussion of these social sustaining services also points to another key problem that goes unrecognized in the standard production process model, namely the time dependence of many of these absorptive, restorative, recreative, and caretaking functions. As Herman Daly and other ecological economists have pointed out, the notion that capital simply offers a substitute for natural resource and labor without consequences and limits is deeply flawed. Georgescu Reagan articulated this critique of standard economic production by emphasizing both the erroneous timelessness and the erroneous contextlessness of the system. And he writes about the later development of the production function, which even dropped natural capital altogether. Mathematical economists have recently come out with a fantastic conjuring trick. We must not worry about the exhaustion of natural resources, since with the aid of the ubiquitous Cobb-Douglas function, it can now be proved that capital can be substituted without limits for those natural resources. So we've now limited it to labor and capital. Much of the weak and strong sustainability debate has focused on the substitution assumption or its limits, and has focused on what is then the capacity of capital, human-made inputs, to substitute for land, non-human-made inputs, and what may be critical thresholds where substitution ends altogether, because some substitution may simply be costly. For example, ecosystem services cannot be replicated without considerable investments, but some substitution may simply be impossible. Despite, for example, the impressive substitution of capital for labor, which accounts for the enormous productivity increases that now account for the jobless recovery, somebody has to push the button, or somebody has to watch the monitors of the increasingly capital-intensive production process. So what has been perceived as, this is the depiction of the typical production function, what has been perceived as a context-less system is in fact a context-bound and context-constrained system with many feedback loops that have significant implications. So what might be an alternative framework of production that brings both the context and the transformation process of inputs into useful output itself into focus? And what might be a concept of a production process that, because it focuses on sustaining its context and sustaining the transformation, can therefore be long-term sustainable? In the late 1970s, Jeddah formulated a model of production that distinguishes between stocks that generate flows and funds that generate services. Now, what's that all about? A stock is a type of input, productive input, that may be used at any given rate, whereas a fund is a type of productive input that can be used only at a certain rate, and that recognizes biological, physiological, ecological constraints. He writes, while the decumulation of a stock may conceivably take place in one single instant or over time, the decumulation of funds is time-dependent and may be used only at a given rate determined by the physical structure of the fund. For example, 7 tons of coal can be burned all at once in one day, or they can be burned 1 ton at a time over 7 days. But a worker can only dig 1 ditch a day over 7 days. He or she cannot dig 7 ditches in 1 day. There are biological, physiological time constraints to that process. The stock flow fund services distinction then allows for a distinction between what Rogan called a viable and a feasible production process. Viable production is characterized by a process that maintains this corresponding material and social structure, and that supports the resourcing and sink functions of productions that happen outside of the production process, but first make the production enterprise itself possible. Every production process may be feasible, but not every production process is viable. So I define as sustaining production a production process that maintains or even enhances underlying services that support the inflow of inputs and the capacity needed to transform them into useful output. Production that undermines or destroys these underlying flows and services is unsustainable and diminishes value. And this definition then makes explicit that the value of production cannot solely be determined by the consumptive value of production, but needs to also take into consideration in its value proposition the underlying social and environmental context structure to maintain long-term productive capacity. So what might that kind of model look like that takes these complexities of the process into account? Such a sustaining production process might look something like this. Now, each quadrant is a schematic representation of the process associated with a systems component of the overall production process. This does not claim to be either comprehensive or that the functional representations look exactly like that. That's the work in progress part. But it does serve as simply as a schematic summary of the concept of production as context-based. And the graphical representation intentionally builds on what is familiar to economists, namely that first quadrant of the production function. So what's going on here? Well, in the first quadrant, you see the familiar formulation of production, namely output Q, as a function of a vector of input flows, including labor, capital, natural resources, but also managerial practices, intellectual capacity, education, relevant inputs that sustain the production process. The function underneath in that second quadrant depicts the emissions corresponding to the production process, whereby emissions E are a function of the same input vector I. E describes the common conception of emission and waste that we term negative externality. As technology changes, the relationship between inputs and outputs will change, and so do emissions generated in the production process. In some cases, technological change may reduce both input flows and emission flows. In other cases, it may lead to a shift in emission flows and merely a substitution of emissions. Quadrant 3 of this figure describes the processes of care, rest, assimilation, absorption, recreation, and restoration that take place between the source of the emission and in situ, the social and environmental context into which they are released. Actually, in my native language, the German, there is a distinction between emissions and emissions. One is spelled E-M-I-S-I-O-N, and the other is spelled I-M-M-I-S-S-I-O-N. That's the in situ, how much of what goes into the system actually is then there, and how much gets otherwise processed, absorbed, reduced, and so forth. Now, it's also important to note that these absorptive care, recreative functions are characterized by very complex interactions in environmental and social context systems. My early work in environmental economics was on nitrate emissions to the groundwater. And that actually can serve as a good example because the emissions levels of nitrates into the groundwater are then significantly impacted by what soil type. What are the aquifer conditions in the first place? What precipitation patterns are there? And numerous other factors that impact that relationship. Labor quality also can be described as a very complex system. It's a function of education, for sure, but it's also a function of rest, recreation, social interaction, meaning, and so much more. So the functional relationship between emissions and their impact depend on the ability of the environmental and social systems to absorb, assimilate, buffer, restore the productive capacity. And emission levels in situ are therefore complex systems. As fund factors, to Jessica Rubin's term, deteriorate, the functional relationship here changes dramatically because absorptive buffer capacities, capacity to restore and provide rest and care are depleted and exhausted, and therefore have a significant impact both on the inflow of inputs into the productive enterprise and the transformation capacity within the production process. So this then allows the formulation of output Q as a function of sustaining services in the system. A process of output generation that qualifies as sustaining will maintain or even improve those sustaining services rather than depleting and undermining them. Conversely, a non-sustainable production process will not reach the same level of output because it misses its underlying material and social structure and cannot possibly reach the same levels of output without further investment into compensatory services to replace the missing, depleted, exhausted, sustaining services. Now, it's important to recognize that a sustaining production process as described here is clearly a crude visual model and must be understood not simply as 4 quadrants, but as a whole system. And that's, of course, also where the conundrum is. As Jessica Rubin pointed out, while an alternative model to production is absolutely necessary to escape the safe, invest, grow cycle, one should not overlook the gigantic problem of applying the model in actual situations. So, where do we go from there? So let me turn to this question of what might this mean for ecological economics and for what we want to explore, learn, etc. Fleshing out and testing this conceptual model of sustaining production clearly is not a one-person undertaking. And over the years, I have greatly enjoyed and benefited from collaboration with colleagues in many fields outside of economics: biologists, hydrogeologists, agricultural science, and actually one of my degrees is in ag economics, so I have a particular connection there. But also philosophy, communication studies, discourse, stakeholder processes. It seems to me that UVM's transdisciplinary research collaborations, the 3 spires of agriculture, neuroscience, behavior, and health, and complex systems, also affirm that benefit of transdisciplinary collaboration, and in fact the growing need for such collaboration as we learn from multiple fields in order to find or stand a fighting chance of finding answers to these really big, pressing questions. And I would submit that one of those is what is, in fact, the path toward a sustaining model of production and welfare generation. So at the same time, I also want to make it clear that I don't intend to spell out here an agenda for the Gant Institute or for ecological economics, but I want to merely share some thoughts that come from my own interests and my own work. So first of all, the model invites collaboration with and learning from multiple social and natural sciences. The underlying process of social and environmental funds and services apply to different scale systems, global systems, like the atmospheric gas balance or climate change, regional ones, like providing genetic material for pest-resistant plants, soil filtration, or zero-emission industrial parks, and local ones like nutrient cycles, food production, and so forth. One of my interests is particularly in regional scale applications of the model, and management, organizational science, decision science, network theory, but also psychology and sociology have much to contribute in this regard. Activity analysis, for example, can offer considerable detail about the production process and the transformation process within the production enterprise itself. But it can also provide insights into the pressures imposed on social and environmental sustaining functions. Different production processes, different organizational patterns require different degrees of restorative, reproductive, preparation time, education, training, and such. So sociology and psychology can also offer important insights here, for example, on work arrangements, organizational structures that facilitate rather than undermining health and recuperation. This kind of process and organization-based work can also form the basis for developing a truly cost of production-based model rather than consumptive value-based model, and much work needs to be done in that regard. The second quadrant of the model, you might say, focuses on unintended emission and waste generated. Different inputs used and different production methods employed lead to different kinds of impacts. I mentioned my early work in nitrate emissions, and there we actually attempted to estimate leachate functions of nitrate as a function of different agricultural practices, watershed conditions, soil conditions, and such. One of my PhD students at RPI used a different methodology, namely regional input-output models, where he applied social accounting matrices to the input-output model to look at the impact of different scenarios of tourism, different types of tourism, and we constrained the tourism scenarios by introducing a nutrient load threshold that then constrained the input-output, and by adding a social accounting matrices, we were able to see how 3 different income levels of households were differently impacted by those nutrient level constraints. A number of other ecological economists also have used input-output analysis to add natural resource accounts and social accounting matrices to introduce context to the enterprise of economic production. And in that model, of course, it's depicted by different sectors and I don't want to go into the critiques of the sort of stagnant coefficients that depict the different production processes. Other fields have also offered a number of contributions to reducing emissions and wastes and to getting a better handle on what these production-dependent emission processes might look like. These fields include industrial ecology, engineering, industrial design, and I find particularly interesting some of the work that looks at networking processes, such as in zero industrial parks and so forth. The third quadrant clearly is the most challenging. Namely, what is the impact of these emissions and wastes on the absorptive, regenerative, recreative, reproductive services that constitute these environmental and social context. The question what happens once the emissions have entered the environment has certainly had a lot of impact and a lot of traction in the strong sustainability debate, where questions have been raised like what are critical load levels in particular ecosystems? How can they be determined? And what emission thresholds result in failure or ultimate collapse of a system? And when do communities fail? That's a much less explored question, but certainly one that has been raised in the aftermath of the Arizona shooting. Namely, when do communities fail, become isolating, lead to stress, overload, inattention, illness? And are there particular architectural designs or bioremediation methods that produce an antidote and that can strengthen rather than undermining absorptive recreative qualities? These are very challenging and complex questions, and one of my particular interests has been in the use of scenario analysis as a way to identify regional and local development scenarios that improve the quality of life, reduce emissions, stress, isolation, and increase environmental quality, social engagement, and innovation. In my own work with Jose Vazquez, for example, we identified 5 indicator categories of such a regionally and locally sustaining production process, and they are sustaining education, health and wellness, environmental quality and recreation access, social and cultural amenities, including social engagement, and access to information and transportation, to be able to reach beyond the local and regional system to get access to larger participation. I've called these the 5 pillars of economic development or of a sustaining economy, with a range of indicators in each of these 5 different categories. And of course, one of the interesting questions to raise based on the work of the Gantt Institute too is which ones of these indicators cut across different contexts and are common, and which are context specific and reflect the specificities of culture and environmental contexts. Interesting work in the sustaining regional economy arena also focuses on the role that culture plays in establishing social sustaining networks of communities and households that strengthen these absorptive capacities rather than undermining them. Juliet Shor's recent work on the plentitude offers some interesting example, as does Bill McKibben's work on hope, human and wild. One of Juliet Shor's conditions for addressing the sustaining economic constraints, for example, is what she calls 80% solution. And that's one of the centerpieces of her work on plentitude, namely a 4-day work week that then can address persistent unemployment, lack of time for civic and social engagement, and so forth. So what about that 4th quadrant, and who do we need to collaborate with? Well, that model of the sustaining function of production as a function of social and environmental flows and funds really needs to raise the question not just how do we formulate the model, but how can we move toward acceptance and implementation of the model. So here, political science, decision science, institutional economics, communication theory may offer particularly useful insights. And I want to get back to that in the 3rd part of my talk, namely what are the barriers and opportunities. So clearly, much analytical work remains. George S. Corrigan was right when he said this is a daunting undertaking to operationalize this complex system. But nonetheless, deliberate attention must be paid to developing and implementing and getting growing acceptance for a production concept that offers alternatives to GDP and does not bump up against these obvious social and environmental constraints. So I want to focus briefly, or sketch out, I should say briefly, 3 areas of opportunities. And they are complexity, participation, and a focus on values. So first, complexity. One of the big success stories of US economic policy is how efficiently it has communicated its message of more is better around the world. This message has fueled a focus on growth in per capita GDP as the very source of social welfare, and has allowed success measures that are simply market price driven and short-term and mechanistic, as if the whole system were reversible, to dominate the debate. The expected increase in well-being, however, has not been as forthcoming as the consistently growing GDP would lead us to believe. Recent research reveals a growing dissatisfaction, growing insecurity, depression, and such. Gus Speth quotes psychologist David Myers in describing the American paradox of, I quote, big houses and broken homes, high incomes and low morale, secured rights and diminishing civility. This should not come as a big surprise, because much of the quality of life research has long shown that material needs make up only a small portion of what constitutes well-being. Many other non-material needs, such as security, social connections, self-esteem, beauty, meaning, constitute important parts of well-being. Yet the concept of well-being being like that of sustaining production has several strikes against it. Namely, it's complex and not easily influenced. Rather than keeping track of one single number, like GDP, the real story of well-being includes information about many different indicators, about complex, nested systems. And these systems reflect different timescales, different success measures, different spatial characteristics, and so forth. So the impact of one particular economic development strategy or one particular economic policy may in fact be pretty ambiguous depending on which set of indicators you look at. For example, a policy may result in lower emissions, good thing, but fewer jobs, not so good. More free time, but reduced open space, you be the judge. More robust ecosystem services, but less aesthetics. So economists call this the non-commensurability problem, where different indicators may go in various ways, therefore making it difficult for decision makers to assess the overall impact of a particular development scenario or policy measures. Seems to me that UVM's transdisciplinary initiative on complex systems can make a tremendous contribution in this regard. And I would be most interested in learning more about what the plans are that are underway in this new research initiative. One of the central questions, namely, is how to assist policymakers and other decision makers in dealing with these complex systems without getting them paralyzed. Past work on the GPI and the Human Development Index certainly offer a way out of the dilemma by offering yet another one number that is a composite indicator. But maybe that too has a downside where information gets lost and exchange relationship between indicators are hidden in a black box of decisions made somewhere else as trade-offs are assessed. So maybe one of the solutions could be in devising principles of decision-making in complex systems. And what are those guiding principles? Second, participation. A critically important question in conceptualizing sustaining production, sustaining development solutions, particularly at the regional and local level, is who communicates the sustaining functions of social and environmental contexts. Commonly, professional experts have been consulted to define both the indicators and trade-offs between the relevant indicator categories. And they have been the primary sources to provide information about critical quality thresholds. Relevant fields of expertise when it comes to sustainable development scenarios run the gamut between microbiology, ecology, public health, ag science, ecological economics, certainly neuroscience, psychology, and so forth. The list is long. But less common are methods to consult those with context-specific local knowledge, and particularly those whose knowledge systems and information is typically marginalized. As feminist scholars have pointed out, the reliance on credentialed expertise alone can easily ignore the fact that different fields, different knowledge systems bring distinct biases to the process of selecting indicators and assessing the trade-offs between indicators. Such biases are typically expressed in quantitative over qualitative information, reducible over complex, universalizable over context-specific, and specialized over variable information. Yet admitting marginalized and less familiar perspectives to the debate is both critically important and no easy task. One of the problems, of course, is that the burdens associated with eroding social and environmental sustaining functions are unevenly distributed. And the poor, those with less access to education, those who have less access to proper care, those with limited access to communication, those saddled with the burdens of providing substitutions for deteriorating support systems, those are the ones who have far less opportunity and far less power to bring their Lebenswelt, life world, to use a Habermas term, to bear in these assessment processes. Successful participation efforts will require leveling the playing field and bringing persistent information, communication gaps to the fore, and to allow room for those whose voices have gone unheard in the common discourse table. One method that I have used with some success is a story writing workshop, where participants are invited to write a collective story about the region and community 15 years into the future. This approach can capture both existing community assets and can point to potential identifiable markets. Yet it requires also considerable thought about who needs to be at the table, what space is accessible and more acceptable and maybe neutral, less barriers to some participants, and how voices that are typically unheard can become heard in the story writing process. Facilitating such a process led me to throw out any preconceived notions that I ever had about being a neutral facilitator, because that kind of facilitating process is about overcoming pre-existing barriers and pre-existing biases. There's some very interesting work by the German economist Adelheid Biesecker, who defined actually 7 conditions of an ethical discourse. Yet as pressures mount to move services from households, volunteer organizations, and subsistence sector to the market, and as the demands within the market economy grow, the time and energy available for such civic engagement continues to decline, and participation in community and regional initiatives is increasingly limited. And this is a real dilemma, since behavioral research confirms the benefits of face-to-face interaction in the decision process. In a recent study, Worley and colleagues found that groups were able to solve a variety of complex problems and exhibited a general collective intelligence. Group composition also raises interesting questions, and I quote, the C factor, what he called the intelligence, the collective intelligence factor, is not strongly correlated with the average or maximum individual intelligence of group members. But it is correlated with an average social sensitivity of group members, the equality in distributing conversational turn-taking, and the proportion of females in the group. The findings suggest surely a need for further research into what is an ideal group composition of a Discord group charged with making decisions or recommendations about economic development, alternatives, and sustaining production research. New research in behavioral and neuroscience has already had an impact on consumer theory and its notion of the self-interested, isolated homo economicus decision maker. And it may also offer new openness to revising the rationality of aggregate output as a primary policy goal. Yet it also raises serious questions about how do we educate and socialize our students, for example, for such social engagement, especially as neuroscience suggests that human behavior is uniquely social, but that neural patterns of intimacy, trust, social intelligence must be established in infancy and trained throughout childhood and adolescence. They need to be practiced in order to be strong decision criteria. Understanding the social basis for human cognitive development is then a key to understanding the nature of decision making and what reference groups, for example, might be most viable. Both are critical to formulating successful pro-social and environmental policies and to gain public acceptance for such policies. UVM's transdisciplinary research focus on neuroscience, behavior, and health can certainly make important contributions here, and while I understand that the focus of this group is primarily on health-related issues, it would be great to include also considerations of how health and wellness are impacted by the persistent neglect of social and environmental sustaining functions that shape commonly held definitions of productivity and value. So last, very briefly, values matter. Growing number of studies indicate that sustainable production debate and the sustainable development debate as a whole may need to be about more than scientific knowledge and improved information. It may simply have to be about values. 81% of Americans now indicate that the country is too focused on shopping and spending. 83% state that the society is not focused on the right priorities, and 88% state that American society is too materialistic. These numbers indicate that there is urgent attention needed and an opening to pursuing the question on how do we best reframe the policy debate to move away from long-held assumptions about the relationship between material wealth and well-being, between giving and getting. Policies as a strategy for return to basic values may offer a more promising approach in many regional and local contexts than the pursuit of increasing enlightened, economically rational individual decision makers. In fact, the focus on values brings us back full circle, namely to the work of the father, so-called father of economics, Adam Smith. Smith's work on the moral sentiment states that the invisible hand of the market that somehow brings about the best for the whole by each individual pursuing their own self-interest is working only within an ethical framework of compassion and concern for one's neighbor. Smith argued that it is only constrained by the imperatives of compassion that the invisible hand of the market brings order to the chaos of self-interested pursuits and also leads to social welfare. So by abdicating to the market the responsibility of setting an ethical framework, we may have abdicated the whole enterprise of welfare generation and maybe subscribe to a minimalist notion of market norms captured in Pareto optimality, one of the favorite subjects of economists. Effective policies, then, will have to rely as much on scientific information and on information sharing as they do about information about shared values, shared norms, and shared ethical standards. This may well require the translation of large-scale problems such as climate change, massive deforestation, species extinction and such into much more small-scale personal stories, since research has shown that large-scale problems tend to lead to indecision and paralysis, whereas framing them in more personal reference points leads to decision-making. The history of U.S. social policy, environmental policy, things like child labor protection, OSHA, Medicare, Social Security, air quality standards, endangered species protection, shows that policies can achieve norms. And so can values of social justice, the protection of natural beauty. But these goals must be expressly stated in policies that call for their protection and for the protection of that which we value and of those who cannot protect themselves. Thank you.